Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. We're so pleased to have you here with us today for a talk with Professor Jascha Nemtsov on his book, The New Jewish School in Music, 1908 to 1938, as a part of the Jewish Cultural Renaissance. This is a really wonderful book. I would say it's the definitive book on Jewish classical music of these movements for those that are interested in it. So I highly recommend it. It was originally written in German and published in 2004, but it's now available in English for those that don't know German. And it has tons of wonderful material we're going to talk about, and I just want to mention that it has at the end these appendices with biographical information about the composers and also catalogs of the publishing companies that these organizations created that disseminated this music. So it's a wonderful resource for anyone interested in this music, but especially for those that might want to program this music or play it themselves. So definitely check it out. And it is for sale on the YIVO bookstore. And I want to say that this topic is really special for us at YIVO because we have some material that's related to what we're going to talk about today. We have the published sheet music of a lot of the composers from these organizations in our general music collection, Record Group 112, for those that want to check it out. And we've been doing performances to share the music of these organizations for a long time. I learned from this book, in fact, that there was a concert that YIVO, or a series of concerts that YIVO presented as far back as 1941 here in New York, which is pretty incredible. And we have archival material related to these organizations. So Record Group 37 is the Jewish Music Society's collection, which is a part of our Vilna collections and actually is available digitally for free through Archive Space, through our archive resources, which includes the institutional records of some of these organizations, or institutional records from some of these organizations. It's not the complete institutional records. And we also have more recently acquired the papers of Lazar Saminsky, one of the composers that will come up today. We have the papers of Lazar Weiner, a composer a little bit at the edge of today's discussion, but nevertheless a very important, wonderful composer who may come up today. And we very recently acquired the papers of Leo Zeitlin. So a lot of important, reasons to be celebrating this scholarship here at YIVO that I wanted to share. Our guest today, Jascha Nemtsov, is a pianist and a musicologist. He was born in Magadan, Siberia in 1963 and studied at the St. Petersburg State Conservatory. Since 2013, he has occupied a full tenure position as professor for history of Jewish music at the Liszt University of Music in Weimar. His academic work focuses on Jewish music and Jewish composers. In 2024, his textbook, Jewish Music Introduction, was published, the first publication of its kind in the world. As a pianist, Nemtsov performs internationally and has recorded over 40 CDs, including numerous premiere recordings of works by rediscovered persecuted composers. He received the German Record Critics Award in 2007 and the Opus Classic Award in 2018. His most recent CD, Ukrainian Preludes, was nominated for the International Classical Music Awards in 2025. So, Jascha, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Alex. It is a pleasure to be here, to be a part of this event. Thank you.
So, for those that don't know about the Society for Jewish Folk Music and all the organizations that came after it, I was wondering if you could just start by telling us the basic story of what is the Society for Jewish Folk Music, and perhaps you could tell it in the way that you do in this book, which is that you explain that there's a bit of a myth that was involved in the tellings of this story by the historians in the 1950s and 60s, who largely got their information from one of the composers, Solomon Rozovsky, who wound up here in New York. And in your book, you talk about what that myth was, but then you also show a more complex story from the archival sources that are in Russia. So tell us, what is the Society for Jewish Folk Music, the myth and the reality?
Yeah, actually, it was initially a very small group of young musicians. Most of them were students at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, a few composers, a singer, a pianist, And what was united them, it was actually their Zionist engagement. So they all were Zionistically oriented, and the idea was just to do something on the musical field, something of the same kind. Yeah, and they wanted. Actually, it was a few years after the first Russian Revolution, and one of the results of the revolution was the liberating of some laws, yeah, and actually the possibility of founding of yeah, organizations, and they tried to found something, the first Jewish institution, of musical art, of secular music, yeah, you can say. And initially, they of course didn't have any program, didn't have any plan. They were young, they lacked experience, and they tried to do something. For example, to organize anniversary of Felix Mendelssohn, a big concert which didn't take place because they were just too small to organize such a big event. They tried to preserve, to perform, to disseminate everything Jewish in the music. And it took some time for them to realize what is actually Jewish in music. And it took some time. It was a result of many discussions, and it was really a circle of musicians who were, for a great part, friends with each other, yeah, who had a very close personal relationships, not just for years, but for decennies. So there is a lot of materials connected to the personal relationship between different actors of this society, between composers, between performers and composers, and everybody. So it was for me just exciting to read so many letters, and in many cases, maybe even in the most cases, I was the first to read these letters after the authors and the adressats. Yeah.
So you talked about they were trying to support Jewish music, and they had to kind of spend some time figuring out what Jewish music is. So maybe we could start with that question. What How did they think about, how did these composers and musicians that were involved with the Society for Jewish Folk Music, how did they think about what Jewish music is, and how did that change over time?
Yeah, there were, you mentioned already that there were a few legends about how they came to the idea of Jewish art music. And some of these legends was about the great Russian composer and the teacher of some of the Jewish composers of the society, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, that he should have set this program. So to one of the members of the society who still was a student of him, and brought a Jewish piece in the class, and Rimsky-Korsakov said, at least according to the legend, compose a few other pieces of that kind, and you will be a Jewish Glinka. Although, of course, it's a nonsense. No, nobody would say such a sentence. Yeah, just it would be too easy to become a Jewish Glinka, and Rimsky-Korsakov was not such stupid to say this sentence. Of course, it was not Rimsky-Korsakov. It was not like a prophet who would come and explain how to do things. It was really a collective result, a result of discussions, a result of yeah, a kind of summary of different opinions on this field, and finally they came together to this belief that Jewish music should base somehow on the folklore, on the tradition of the people. And actually, it was a very similar kind of many other different national currents in the European music already since the mid of the 19th century, like the Czech national music with Smetana and Dvořák, or Norwegian with Edvard Grieg, or later Hungarian with Bartók and Kodai. So actually, it was the same. You have to go to the national soil, so to say, yeah, to study the folklore, to record, to arrange, and finally coming to free compositions based on this kind of idiom.
That might be a good segue to Joel Engel or Uli Engel. This is one of the composers who figures really importantly in the mythology, in the myth version behind the history, and certainly was extremely active and contributed a lot to this field at this time. So, can you tell us about Engel and touch on this idea of what the myth was?
Yeah, of course, Julia Engel was a very important figure of this Jewish musical renaissance, and he was much older than all other protagonists of the society, and he was already a prominent figure in the Russian musical life. First of all, as a music critic. He was a renowned critic. He wrote for the best Russian newspapers, and he was actually feared as a critic. Yeah, he was pretty hard. And as a composer, he didn't make any name of himself because his creative talent was probably rather restricted, and at the initial stage of the society, for the composers, it was very important to have Engel as a kind of prominent figure among them, because all others were just young musicians, no names. Yeah, and he was already very prominent, and I think it is one of the reasons for the later some for the creation of this myth Engel, because there is a definite role of Engel in the national Jewish music, but there's also a myth uh, behind of it. And another reason for the myth of Engel is, of course, he himself, because he was very good in promoting himself. Yeah, you can just say here he was very active in promoting also his works, and I found a lot of materials regarding that, regarding his role in Jewish publication activities, and he led a publishing house first in Moscow, then in Berlin, and actually he promoted first of all his own compositions, and just the quantity of these compositions was considerable. So it was maybe in Moscow it was about 80% of all production of the publishers, and in Berlin it was at least a considerable part, maybe more than a half. And of course, when you have all this printed music, and most part of it is with the name Engel, you think, okay, this is the most important composer of the whole group.
So I want to go more into the music itself in a minute, but before we do, I was wondering if you could sketch out for us a little bit more about the kind of social and political landscape that the Society for Jewish Folk Music emerged into. You already talked a little bit about musical nationalism, and you gave some examples. And of course, this is really happening in Russia in a big way with, not just Glinka, but Rimsky-Korsakov himself, the people that are educating these composers in St. Petersburg. And you also talked about, the first Russian Revolution kind of opening up Russian civil society, and that was an important aspect. And then there's also the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. So could you just sketch out a little bit more of the kind of context?
Yes, of course. The title of my book includes this words Jewish cultural renaissance, and actually it was Martin Buber, the great German Jewish philosopher and Zionist, who first used this term Renaissance in regard of the Jewish national movement, and it was really a kind of cultural renaissance. It was already a time after the first achievements of the Haskalah. There was already a great amount of Jewish intelligentsia living not in the Pale of Settlement anymore, but in the mid of Russian society, having a very good education, being involved in Russian cultural life, and actually already on their way to the assimilation. And the begin of the Zionist movement, and Zionist movement was at the time not only political, but also, and for this topic it is the most important, a cultural movement. Yeah, for example, shaped by people like Ahad Ha'am, who made a great influence, who had a great influence on many of these musicians in this group. So for them it was important, a kind of creation of a new secular national Jewish culture, not anymore based on the religion, but suited to the modern world, based on the traditions, but as a part of future national Jewish state. So it was the motivation. And you can see that the musical activities, for example, in the last years of the St. Petersburg Society, they were directly connected to Palestine. Yeah, you maybe heard of this story of the chamber music ensemble of Zimro, who was founded by the St. Petersburg Society and went on tour, on the world tour, with the purpose of creating a temple of arts in Palestine.
Yeah, we just featured on our YouTube channel recently the concert program from their Carnegie Hall debut concert, which I think was 1919. Is that right? And we have a copy. You feature it in your book as well, and you tell the story of the Zimro Ensemble. And we have a copy in the archive in the collection of the cellist Joseph Chernyavsky, who settled in New York and became a Yiddish, involved in the Yiddish theater as well. So it's a fascinating group of people. It's a great story.
Absolutely.
Before we dive more into the music itself, can you just tell us about the term, the New Jewish School? Where does it come from, and what exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, I actually found different names of this group, and an official name, there was no official name. You cannot find any letters with how do you say it in English, briefkopf, so head, a letter head, placing New Jewish School. But this term was used by many prominent members of this group, for example, by Josef Achron, by Michael Gnesin. And for me, it was one of the first texts which I read on my journey to discovering this group of composers, was a text by Gershon Svet, published in New York in I think in the early 60s, when I remember correctly, in Russian. In Russian, then in the English translation, and he used also this term "New Jewish School." And actually, it was a very logical term in my eyes, because the Russian School of Composers was a kind of role model for these young Jewish composers, and the Russian school, which also is known under the name the Mighty Five. It is called in Russia the New Russian School, and New Russian School, New Jewish School, so it is a kind of parallel. Yeah, and I found it as a very, very good name, and it was used by the members of the school to call themselves in that way. So I chose this name.
So we're talking here about Jewish art music, like classical music, written by conservatory trained composers, that is using European forms, classical compositional techniques, but seeking to create a Jewish output, and they're doing that in all these different ways, pulling from Yiddish folk song and other materials. So can you just start to bring us into the music? What were some of the different strands of how these composers thought about creating Jewish art music?
Yeah, of course, they started just arranging folk melodies which came to the society through different chances, through different ways. There were a few members of the society who already had collected some folklore materials. First of all, it was Zinovy Kiselgov, a teacher in a Jewish school and not a musician, but a passionate lover of Jewish music. And Kiselgov spent several summers in the Pale of Settlement. He had also relatives there, among others, in the village of Lubavitch, in the cradle of the Hasidism, of the Chabad Hasidism. And he had already a considerable collection at the moment when the society was founded. And he became the member, and he uh, put his collection at the disposal to the composers, and some of them also collected folklore materials like Saminsky or Achron or no, no, uh, Shalit, yeah, and some other people who just wrote down melodies they heard from different people, and so it were first just a very small arrangement with a few chords just to make it possible to perform. Like they call it not composition, but they call it folk songs. Yeah, they pretended to perform folk songs for voice and piano, for voice and violin and piano, and very small compositions. But a few years later, uh, maybe 4 or 5 years later, some of the composers who, of course, were maybe the most talented of the group, they just were not anymore content with that kind of composition because you cannot develop as a composer when you write only such small arrangements. And first of all, Moshe Milner and Josef Achron, they were probably the first ones to try to write free compositions on the base of the folklore, but without primitive citing of folklore melody or like uh, going aside of this form of arrangement.
And in terms of, the original Yiddish, the arrangements of Yiddish folk song, we're talking especially Engel, but Saminsky and many of the other composers are really engaged in this as well. Um, what else comes next after? So Milner and Achron are creating kind of like free musical language that is using the material of folk song, but then composers start picking up Hebrew cantillation, and poetry. So yeah, where else do they bring this?
Yeah, yeah. The material changed. Also, the folklore material changed considerably because they started with the Yiddish songs, and they afterwards they discovered for themselves cantillations, like you mentioned, and it was, of course, a material of a completely different kind, and you don't have to deal with the melody of maybe 8 bars or 16 bars, but you have just small motifs, and you can do everything with this kind of yeah, rough materials, and you can see that in the following years a great deal of big compositions were created like sonatas and string quartets, and very soon also operas and symphonies and all possible European big forms, not only this small arrangement, but really big concert forms in all kinds.
Let's go back to folk song for just a moment. So you talked about Kisselgoff and who was coming with already having done ethnographic work and sharing with composers, and you mentioned that some of the other composers are doing their own ethnographic work. Um, can you talk a little bit about how the society, published and in order to disseminate this work and concert lectures and that sort of thing, focusing on folklore for a second.
Yeah, of course. The first part was to produce the pieces, to arrange the folk songs, and the second part was the disseminating. And like you say, they founded a publishing house. They printed several series of publications, altogether more than 80 works by the composers, members of the society, and they organized a lot of concert events. And you can imagine when you go as a Jew in a concert and you can listen to Jewish music from the stage. It was a completely new experience for all these people, and the audience was extremely excited. So it was like a sensation. This concert, they organized several concerts every year alone in St. Petersburg, but afterwards also in many other Russian cities and also abroad. There were concert teams who went on tour to Europe and afterwards also to North America. And the concerts in St. Petersburg, there were an audience of, for example, 1,500 people. Yeah, and so it was sold out. There were a lot of press reports. So it was really a part of great public musical life, also of Russian musical life.
So it started with these, folk arrangements, and like you said, they're wildly popular. But as you started explaining before, they're moving towards free composition and expanding to bigger forms, exploring things like Hebrew cantillation and using that to build a style of music that's more, flexible and can do different things compositionally. There's this really fascinating polemic that comes up between Engel and Saminsky, one of the other composers that we've mentioned a few times. Can you talk a little bit about that? That comes up in your book, and it's a fascinating kind of window into this argument of these composers trying to figure out, what is Jewish music and what's the way forward for this movement.
Yeah, yeah, I think this polemics, which is published and very well known, in the meanwhile, it has two different sides. The first side, in my eyes, is the aesthetical side. It is actually the discussion about how to choose the material and how to prove the national value of this material. So Engel was for a more liberal way, and Saminsky for a strict way. But this aesthetical discussion was only one side, and the other side, it was really a struggle about the influence in the society. Yeah, it was I think also the personal struggle, because for Engel it was very difficult to accept that he was not the number one anymore in the society. He was not this prominent figure as the head of the whole movement, and actually other much younger musicians proved to be yeah, rather able to create this new musical style.
And can you just flesh out a little bit what is the argument between them?
Yeah, Saminsky was against using popular Jewish melodies in the new compositions of the new Jewish school. For example, against using the songs of Mark Warszawski, yeah, who were extremely popular in the Jewish milieu, and he had a kind of hierarchy of Jewish music. So on the top, it should be the cantillations at the oldest part and the most authentic part, and afterwards the second shift is the synagogal music, and then the Yiddish songs, and yeah, the very low is the Jewish popular music, like these songs of Warszawski. And Engel was against this sorting out some materials who were not that authentic Jewish, because he pleaded for inclusiveness, so to say. So he wrote that everything which is sung by Jews is somehow Jewish, and everything should belong to the Jewish culture. So I wouldn't say he was wrong and he was right. For me, both of them were somehow right. Yeah. And I think really it was also about influence, about personal relationships, about their role in this within the society.
So earlier you had mentioned that, these some of these composers are expanding to bigger genres like sonatas and even symphonies, symphonic works, operas, concertos. Can you tell us about some of the kind of banner achievements in these larger genres? Because I'll just say that people that frequent our concert hall are probably they're probably familiar with a lot of the chamber music and a lot of the art songs. And for those that aren't, check them out on our YouTube channel. But these larger works are ones that you can seldom hear today. So can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, yeah. Of course, there are not so many operas and symphonies, just for very simple reason. It was much easier to perform chamber music or songs or piano solo compositions than an opera or a symphony. But there are still several big works which I think deserve more public attention. First of all, of course, the first Jewish operas in Yiddish and in Hebrew. The opera by Moshe Milner, the Himmeln brennen, the heaven, how to say, burn, and in Yiddish performed for the first time in Petrograd, also future Leningrad, former St. Petersburg, in 1923, and banned by the Soviet censorship, or after only two performances. And as far as I know, except of some excerpts of this opera as a whole, it was not performed anymore. And the first opera in Hebrew was written by Mikhail Gnesin. It was a chamber opera written in Palestine, where Gnesin spent several months in 1921-22. And the opera is called Abraham's Youth, and it is really a wonderful work. I was able to organize a performance in Germany, the first stage performance, and the Israeli colleague Rita Flommenbaum had organized even before, a few years before, a concert performances. So with this opera, it is anyway the first Hebrew opera in the music history. So, and of course, when we talk about big forms, we have to mention the compositions by brothers Crane. Yeah, the symphony of Alexander Crane, and also several symphonic works by his brother Grigory Crane. Just wonderful music based largely on the motifs of biblical cantillations.
So Moscow has come up a few times, and we are talking about the St. Petersburg, Society for Jewish Folk Music. tell us about the Moscow branch, and let's start expanding our view.
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, this movement in Jewish music still very often called the St. Petersburg School. And I think this name is really misleading because only a very few years it was restricted to St. Petersburg, the first years, but already in 1913, so 5 years after the foundation of the society in St. Petersburg, the Moscow branch was founded, and very soon after, some other branches in Kiev and Odessa and Kharkov and some other cities were founded, and the activities of the society embraced the whole Russian Empire, you can say, and also took place abroad. And Moscow still was one of the most important branches after St. Petersburg, and they had several active composers. The leading role was played by Yuli Engel, and there were also both brothers Crane there among the members, and which I mentioned before, and several performers. Maybe the most important of them, David Shore, a wonderful and famous pianist, really a very important figure in Russian music and in Jewish musical life. And the Moscow branch and the St. Petersburg headquarters, so to say, they stopped their activities soon after the revolution, but in the 20s, during the temporarily liberation of Soviet life, after the between 1923 and 1929, another society was founded or refounded in Moscow, you can say, under David Shor, and this society was until my research practically completely unknown to public, and I was the first to found complete documentation of this society in an archive in Moscow, and it was for me really extremely exciting to see that during the Soviet time the activities on this field not exceeded, but even achieved a new level, because it was really only about free composition in a very advanced style. So there were many composers among the members of the society, Gnesin, both cranes, actually three cranes, because there was a third crane, a son of Grigory Crane, Julian, who was also very talented composer, Alexander Veprik, an extremely important figure in Jewish art music of that time, and several younger composers like Grigory Gamburg, Zinove Feldman, Samuel Sinderai. So, really many creative figures who enriched this already existing repertoire of Jewish art music with a great amount of new works, and many of them really in big forms, like sonatas and string quartets, and like Symphony of Crane, which I already mentioned, and many other works.
So one thing I want to underscore here is the shift that happens, in the Soviet period after the 1917 revolution. Some of the branches close and things change. Can you just talk a little bit more about how how the Soviet period kind of changes the way that these organizations function, and how that gradually changes through the Soviet years, and the way that uh, Jewish music fared differently than other ethnic minority national musics.
Yeah, yeah. It is a very complex question. After the revolution, I think nobody could imagine what would come, and how the all this crisis would develop. And in the first month after the revolution, you can see just new concerts take place, and a lot of plans were made, and they tried to they not only tried, but they produced a lot of printed music in Moscow under the leadership of Engel, and this new chamber music ensemble Zimro was founded, and some other groups. And already, yeah, like 8 months after the revolution, hardly any events are possible, because the civil war began, and the difficulties to getting to get food were really extreme. And the second winter after the revolution was already a catastrophe, because in big cities people didn't have anything to warm their apartment, they didn't have anything to eat. It was also a time of yeah, infections, yeah, pandemics, and it was a very difficult time, and many people just left cities, because on the countryside you could survive a bit easier, yeah, to getting at least something to eat. And the society was not closed by the Bolsheviks or not forbidden. They just didn't have any resources to exist. Yeah? Nobody could pay anything, and it was actually the time of the so-called war communism, that money just was abolished. So it was everything distributed by the state, and so how you could organize a concert as a private society. So everything, all the cultural life of the time was funded completely by the state. And the state didn't have much interest in the St. Petersburg Society. So it was actually the only reason for them to stop to exist. And after a while, the crisis was such terrible that the new Bolshevist government decided to change the economical politics, and small private factories were allowed, and yeah, groups of people appeared who again got some money, they could get some money, and among them were also a few Jews, and they funded this new Moscow society. They were called NEPMAN, so like New Economic Policy, NEP, and NEPMAN as people who profited from these new economic policies. And they were sponsors of these concerts in Moscow and of the whole society, and it lasted for, like I mentioned, about 5-6 years. And already at the end of the 20s, the Soviet government under Stalin already, they yeah, stopped the new economic policies, and all these small private factories were became possession of the state. Yeah, and it happened again absolutely the same situation. So the new Moscow society also stopped to exist, just because of the lack of funds, not because it was prohibited. But at the time, also the general politics of the state toward the Jewish culture changed, and we can see that around 1930, a lot of Jewish cultural institutions, which were until then independent, yeah, not that much involved in the state structures and not that dependent on the communist ideology, they were all shut. And like the Jewish Museum in Leningrad and the Jewish Historical Ethnographic Society in Leningrad, which was very important in Jewish cultural life and which preserved the materials of the Ansky expedition and so on. So the Jewish cultural life was more and more restricted. And it was a part of the Soviet ideology of the time. All national movements in music and in the culture in general were supported, and it was only one exception. It was the Jewish music and Jewish culture, because it was not regarded as the part of the future multicultural Soviet nation.
So moving west, some of these ideas and some of the composers themselves spent important time in Germany and in Austria. Can you talk about the milieu there?
Yeah, yeah. After the revolution, after this several years of crisis and war and chaos, during this time it was impossible to leave the country. It was just very hardly possible. But after it was over, many people just tried to escape somehow and somewhere. It was it was completely the same for them, just to leave Russia. And the only Western European country who had a diplomatic relationship to the Soviet Russia was Germany. Yeah, and that was the reason why so many Russian people, but also Russian Jewish people, came at that time to Germany, and first of all, of course, to Berlin, and especially this area where I live by chance now, Charlottenburg. It was called at the time Charlottengrad, because of so many Russians living here, and Russian stores and Russian activities and cultural organizations. It was really a very intensive Russian-speaking cultural life here in Berlin, and among all these people, and there were really hundred thousands of people coming to Germany from Russia at the time. There were also several activists, several actors of the St. Petersburg Society for Jewish folk music, and they tried to reorganize some of their activities, and especially important for them was printing the music, because the printing editions from St. Petersburg were not available outside of Russia, and in the meantime many new works were composed, and the authors wanted to have their music be printed, and so actually two publishing houses were founded in Berlin almost simultaneously, almost at the same time, at the end of 1922 and at the beginning of 1923. Two publishing houses, one of them was called Juwal and the other one Yibneh. But very different aesthetical programs, so completely different style. Yuval was led by Engel, and it represented rather the Yiddish style based on the Yiddish folklore, Yiddish folk song, and the other publisher, Yibneh, was led by Achron, and by Gnesin for some time, and they represented rather the Hebrew direction in this movement, based on the Cantillation, on the biblical music, and afterwards on the new Jewish folklore from Palestine.
How did these ideas fare? So you talk about in the book how basically, this flourishing here in Germany and Austria, of course, is cut short by National Socialism in Germany. And of course, already spoke about how the Soviet oppression kind of, if not through censorship, through just the privation of funds, effectively ended these movements in the Soviet Union. How did these ideas fare in the land of Israel and then the state of Israel and in the United States?
Yeah, but first we probably should tell the European story to the end. I mentioned
Please. Yeah,
this short period in Germany, which was really pretty short, just 2 or 3 years, because of the economical crisis in Germany of the time, and most of these musicians like Engel and Achron and Gnesin, all of them uh, pretty soon already left Germany, and Engel went to Palestine, Achron went to the USA, Gnesin went back to Russia. So also both publishers ceased their activities, but from the mid of the 20s, a new important center of the new Jewish school emerged, and it was Vienna. It was the capital of Austria, and a new protagonist of the school, Joachim Stutschewsky, moved to Vienna shortly before, and Stutschewsky was really maybe the most important figure of the new Jewish school from that time and to the end of the 30s. He was born in the today's Ukraine, and in a klezmer family, in a very traditional Jewish milieu. Became then a classical education in Leipzig at the conservatory. He was cellist himself, and in the beginning of the 20s, he came to Vienna to participate in the circle of Arnold Schoenberg in the new Viennese school. He was a member of the college quartet. He was very close to all these important important figures of the new music in Austria, like Arnold Schoenberg and Alban Berg and Anton von Webern, and they performed together the many new works of this musical avant-garde. But from the mid of 20s, Stutschewsky also was very much interested in the ideas of Jewish musical renaissance. And in 1928, he was the moving spirit of a new Jewish musical society founded at the time in Vienna, Verein zur Förderung jüdischer Society for advancement of Jewish music. And for 10 years, from 1928 to 1938, when the Nazis came to, when the Germans occupied Austria. So these 10 years, the Viennese Society was the most important institution of the new Jewish school, and actually a kind of the European headquarters of this movement, because you can see already from the end of the 20s on, a lot of Jewish musical societies were founded in many different European countries, in Poland and in Yugoslavia and in Hungary and in Letland, everywhere where Jews lived at the time. This interest in new Jewish music emerged at the time, and it's actually I dedicated a great part of the last chapter of this book to these developments, but actually a new book is necessary to describe, to research, and of course to describe all these unbelievable activities, because it was a huge network of Jewish music societies, international network, and I was able to see only a part of documentation of these activities in the archive of Stutschewsky in Tel Aviv, and he made an amazing job at the time, connecting people from different countries and trying to help, trying to organize concerts. And for example, in Krakow, there was not only a Jewish musical society for Jewish music, but even a Jewish conservatory of music, so a Jewish music school on a very high level. So it is actually a big story which still has to be told. Yeah, before the German came and before the Second World War began and put an end to all these activities.
And I just want to say, for those curious about Stutschewsky's music, we did a big concert here a few years ago where we had performed many of Stutschewsky's works, and it's really interesting material. It's definitely a fascinating chapter of this story as you're describing. So we just have a few minutes left here. We have a few questions from the audience, and maybe you can wrap up um, before we go to audience questions with just this question of the kind of afterlife of these movements outside of Europe, particularly in the United States and in Israel.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, the year 1938, when the German came to Austria, it was kind of break, but it was not the completely end, because the most of musicians they survived the war and the Holocaust. They escaped to different countries. They could save their lives, and they were able to save the music. And you can see that many of them landed finally in the United States and in the Palestine. For example, Stutschewsky escaped Austria just a few days before the German came, and he spent the rest of his long life in Palestine, then in Israel. And many others like Achron and Saminsky and Jakob Weinberg or yeah, some other protagonists of the former St. Petersburg Society, they lived in the United States, and they participated in the activities of Jewish Music Forum, of other organizations promoting Jewish music, and there were festivals of Jewish music, of Jewish art music, including this repertoire of the New Jewish School. But of course, it was not anymore the same. It was not anymore this circle of composers with very close relationships, with discussions, with gatherings. It was just a different kind of Jewish musical life, more maybe, yeah, maybe on a different level. Just and a separate story is the development in Israel, because maybe one could expect, yeah, Israel would be the most appropriate place for further development of the New Jewish School and its ideas. But in fact, even those musicians who came to Israel, like Stutschewsky, and who tried to promote the ideas of New Jewish School, they had enormous difficulties, because the whole Eastern European part of Jewish culture was for very long time neglected in Israel, and he himself found himself finally as a marginal figure of Israeli musical life, was very alone, very unhappy there as a musician. He was neglected, and he tried to suit himself somehow. He learned Hebrew, he wrote many songs, and very interesting music, by the way, wonderful music. For example, his Palestinian, or later renamed as an Israeli suite for cello and piano, is just amazing, amazing piece of music, and many of his songs are very beautiful, and piano works. He will still remained active as a composer, but he saw it not more possible to establish a group, to establish an institution, to establish anything which would develop the ideas by new Jewish school in Israel anymore.
So we have a few questions from the audience. One is about Poland. The audience member asks, what do we know about the reception of Jewish national music in Poland? Stutschewsky and Wolfson collaborated with Krakow musicians, as you mentioned. Did they comment about this cooperation in any way in letters that you've read or anywhere else? And what about other Polish cities? Wolfson was born in Warsaw. Did he work there? Did he cooperate with Jewish musicians in Warsaw?
Mhm. Also Wolfson was born in Poland but he didn't live very long there. He studied then in Moscow, in Paris, and came finally to Vienna, where he actually was based his until 1938, when he had to flee Austria and to go to the United States. But he came several times to Poland and to some other cities, to Czechoslovakia, for example, to play concerts. He performed several times, among others, also in Krakow, his Hebrew suite for piano with symphony orchestra. Which I performed also with an orchestra a few years ago in Germany, and but his role in this collaboration with the Polish institutions was not as important as the role of Stutschewsky, who regularly visited Poland, and he was very close to the Krakow Society for Jewish Music, and he regularly visited the Jewish music school in this city. It is pretty much known about this Krakow society, and about its leading figure, who himself was not a musician. He was a lawyer and music critic, Henryk Apte, who was murdered in the Holocaust. Afterwards, they were very active. They were anyway more active than a similar society in Warsaw. I found the documents of the Warsaw Society of Jewish Music, who was founded at about 1927 or 1928. I found the documents of this, at least some of the documents, in Tel Aviv. Yeah, also in the Felicia Blumenthal Music Center and Library, and at least in the first years, this society was pretty active. There were several concert programs, and they were. I still think that probably some documents about the Jewish Musical Society could be found in the Polish archives. I think it would be important to make some research there. And another important center was Yugoslavia, and especially Zagreb, where a wonderful composer and a singer, Aron Marko Rotmüller, was based, and the society Omanut, the art, was founded there together with the music publishing house and together with its own magazine Omanut. So it is also a whole exciting story which has to be written one day.
So the preponderance of people that have come up today are men, and one viewer is asking, were there any female composers or arrangers active among these various organizations?
Yeah, it's of course an important question. There were not so many women among the composers at the time. One of them was Lyubov Streicher, a pupil of Mikhail Knesin and a very close friend of Knesin, but she was not very active as a composer. He wrote only a few works in Jewish style. Among them is a string quartet in the 20s and several arrangements of Jewish folk songs. But yeah, other than Lyubov Streicher, I couldn't no, I couldn't say any other name of a female composer, unfortunately.
Yeah, Daniel Karkner writes in the chat that Lara Cherniavsky, Joseph Cherniavsky's wife, Joseph Cherniavsky was the cellist of Zimro
Yeah,
Ensemble,
yeah.
was active as an arranger, but I do believe that that was in the U.S. and more for I don't know if she arranged for them or if she was more arranging for Yiddish theater stuff, but thanks for mentioning her, Daniel. One final question: where can people access scores if they're curious? And I'll add to this question recordings and maybe speak a moment about the work that you've done. And I'll just briefly say that our collections at YIVO is one of the places, and people can come and look at material in our reading room. If you're not able to make it to New York, you can actually email reference@yivo.org and they can take some reference photos for you because we really want to make sure that you get access to the material. But you'd be surprised that there's a lot of material actually on IMSLP, for example, like freely available online. And the American Society for Jewish Music also did a digitization project where you can access a lot of the sheet music um,
Yeah.
on their website. So it's a there's a lot of it out there. But yeah, Yasha, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about other places people could go for music if what they're looking for they can't find in one of those easier places, and also tell us about your recordings and how people can access them, what you recommend.
Yeah, the musical scores. It's a very important issue because I collected the copies of the printed music and also of the manuscript in many different archives in different countries, in Russia and in Israel, in the United States, and several European countries. And many years ago, I tried to. They are trying to organize a big publishing project with all this stuff because I thought it is really very important that it would be available to general public. But I must say it was impossible to organize because of the question of rights. Uh, the most publications of New Jewish School from the 20s got into possession of the universal edition of Vienna, which was at the time the most important publishing house for modern music in Europe. And all people I talked to about this question, they said, okay, it is very very difficult and the riots and nobody would dare to publish this music without securing the rights of the compositions. So I for myself when I got emails asking for music, I of course sent all kind of music I possess myself. Yeah, but there is no source, no library where you can find everything. Yeah. So unfortunately, as for my recordings, so they all available on YouTube and on Amazon. Who, when somebody is still listening to the physical CDs, so at least they are all available. So I know that almost all my CDs are on YouTube. So they were distributed by Naxos, and they put everything actually on YouTube.
And they're available on all the streaming sources as well, like
Yes, of
Spotify.
course, Spotify and whatever it. Yeah, so if
Do you have
somebody, yeah.
if you have many recordings, would you recommend one or two to start with for someone for whom this music is totally new?
Actually, I made a series of chamber music recordings produced by Hensler Classics, and some time ago they re-edited uh, them, and it is a set of 5 CDs I can show from Jewish life.
From Jewish Life.
From Jewish life, yeah, SVR music, and Hensler. Actually, under the label of you cannot see it, yeah.
Yeah, it's blurry. If
Yeah,
you
it is. anyway, a set of 5 CDs from Jewish life.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and here's basically chamber music, and one of these 5 CDs is with songs by the New Jewish School.
Wonderful.
Uh,
Well, that's about what we have time for. Yasha, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And I urge everyone out there to check out this book. Like I said, it's a tremendous research resource for those that want to learn about this repertoire and these composers and these organizations. And an amazing, tells the story of all of it, but also has this biographical information about each composer and the catalogs of these publishing organizations so that you can go and go on your wild goose chase to find this rare piece of sheet music, whether it's here at Evo, somewhere online, or at one of these archives around the world. Yasha, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.